welcome to the Generative Energy Podcast. I'm Danny Roddy of DannyRoddy.com, and today I'm talking with Georgi, aka Haidut of RayPeatForum.com. Georgi is an independent health researcher and the owner of Idea Labs, a small company producing high-quality, boutique supplements with the focus of supporting a healthy metabolism. Today, Georgi and I will present a physiological argument against the so-called essential polyunsaturated fats, or PUFA, and we'll detail why we think they are the main promoters of inflammation, stress, and aging. In addition to thanking Georgi for talking with me today, I wanted to thank my patrons, and you can become a patron by going to patreon.com/DannyRoddy. And just my heart goes out to all the people supporting me and making this content possible. So without further ado, let's talk with Georgi, aka Haidut. And Georgi, I just wanted to say that I found your posts a few years ago, and they were just so filled with content, and they were so clear, and it was obviously that you had a zest for learning on your own and confirming a lot of the things Ray has said in interviews and his newsletters, and I was just curious how your own journey started.
Finding Peat, it all started back in 2009. I was a little bit into health hacking even before that. I was a active athlete in college, and I was always mindful of what I eat. I got influenced, unfortunately, like many people, I think, by the whole Paleo diet circle. And I went low carb for a long time. Oh, I wouldn't say a long time, but between 2006 to 2009, I would say I was eating pretty strict, hardcore Paleo diet. And while that initially gave me a lot of energy, I felt that just something is just not right. It was taking me a lot longer to recover from workouts. I wasn't sleeping well, things like that. But, if anybody that I talked to, they basically said, well, what do you care? You felt this is like the most energetic you've ever felt, so it must be a good thing. And only later I did realize that, cortisol is these things will make you, cortisol and estrogen will make you feel so energized, but they're really sort of the devil in a mask, because eventually they do contribute to the pathology of most degenerative conditions that we are witnessing nowadays. So between 2006 2009, I was sort of sticking to the paleo, and around 2009, I started getting these weird sinus infections. Unfortunately, spread to my ear. I started having balance issues. I kept seeing doctors. I probably saw my primary care physician at least once a week. And I went on several rounds of antibiotics, which seemed to clear things up. But then, invariably they would come back. And, ultimately it all came down to cortisol, because given how high it is, obviously it was suppressing my immune system. So that, I started to get these weird neurological symptoms. So I got referred to a neurologist. I got a lot of MRI scans, all kinds of scans. I knew radiation is bad even from before that, so I managed to avoid most of the X-rays and the CT scans that were offered to me, so I mostly got MRIs. But basically, long story short, after about a year and a half of testing, everybody said everything's, there's nothing structurally wrong with you, but I kept deteriorating. And I was reading I found the first time I heard about Peat was on Reddit. I was commenting on some studies that showed basically that, the paleo diet is good for you, things like that. And then some random user, I don't think he's even a member or she's a member of Reddit anymore, said, well, I think you all guys are wrong. This thread is full of BS. You should really read more. Check out this guy. He knows his stuff. And then, I just clicked on the link, and the first article from the very top, the moment I started reading it, I realized, this guy he knows his stuff. It's not so much about being right, but, everything that he says makes sense, and everything that I managed to check made sense. So that was really, how it all started. So between 2009 and 2011, I was essentially focused on regaining my health. And knock on wood, since I would say 2011, 2012, I have not had any of these weird neurological symptoms. And this sort of, I don't want to say convinced me that Peat is right, but it convinced me that the guy has a point. That got me researching even more. And I just sort of, was naturally curious, got interested in the stuff, and I found that it sort of gives me this like nice hobby, so to speak, which is so different from my day job that it gives me a way of, recovering from the travails of the day job by doing by researching and getting involved with the Peat ideas. And also, it's of all the people that have reached out to me for advice, I don't know. I feel good about knowing that I've managed to help some people, even though the FDA doesn't want to hear that.
Well, you've helped me too. You're a prolific poster, and on Ray Peat Forum. And the way you kind of highlight and make the studies, like, truth be told, like I sometimes I can't interpret the really complex studies and they're just over my head. But you have a way of presenting things that's like, oh, I can understand that. But I was curious, what was like the giveaway when you went to Ray's site? Were you like, oh, this guy has something different to say about cortisol that made you interested in him?
No, it was actually aspirin, because
Aspirin.
I've known for a long time. Yeah, I'm originally from Bulgaria, and in Eastern Europe, aspirin has this sort of the reputation of the drug that cures it all. And I've always thought, it's just what old people say. Modern medicine really has an answer for all these things that, they just think aspirin cures it all, but it's really just, old people stuff that they don't know what they're talking about. But when I read his article, on aspirin, I think it's called Aspirin Brain Cancer, right?
Mm-hmm.
And if you start reading it, it just backs up everything that I've been hearing since very early childhood. Things that, aspirin is like the best thing you can do for heart attack preventions, for stroke prevention, for even for like basically, slowing down the aging process, so to speak. Both of my grandmothers are still alive. They're into their late 80s and they're very active. I want to say they're more active now than I was back in my paleo diet days. And both of them take aspirin on a daily basis, and they have done so over the last 60 years. I mean, they've started taking it in their 20s. So, after I started reading his article and, followed up on all of the links and checked the research, and if you go to PubMed, there are like literally millions of articles on aspirin, and not a single one is negatively framed. I mean, that must tell you something.
Was it aspirin that made you more curious about the polyunsaturated fats and their role in inflammation, stress, and aging?
Yeah, I mean, basically, what I did is there are several inflammation markers. So after I basically quit going to doctors, or I still see my primary care physician once a year, sort of just to keep him happy because he's a nice guy, and actually he does agree with a lot of what Ray Peat has to say. But basically, I started doing my own blood tests, and I noticed that initially my inflammation markers were they weren't elevated, but they were close to the upper range, like the C-reactive protein, the erythrocyte sedimentation rate, and I also measured some of the prostaglandins. So basically, they were all like borderline high. And then I noticed that after taking aspirin, which is actually, really the summary is what got me into Ray Peat and got me out of my troubles, probably for the biggest part was aspirin. I started taking high doses. And then I noticed that within a month, all of these inflammation markers went down. Now, officially, aspirin is just a COX inhibitor, and none of these things that aspirin managed to do are explainable by the COX mechanism. So there must have been something else that aspirin was doing, and as I started researching, I noticed that, one of the things that aspirin does is it inhibits lipolysis, right? Mm-hmm. So it would lower the elevated free fatty acids in the blood. Now, Ray says that, saturated fat is fine if those are the fatty acids in your blood, but it's still not a good thing. So basically, I noticed that aspirin is helping, and then I did some experiments. I would stop aspirin, and I would only eat coconut oil, and I noticed that my inflammation markers would stay low. But if I, started eating regular food, quote unquote regular, because it's really not regular, it's poison. But if you want to eat commercial food, you don't have much of a choice. Whenever I would eat, even a tiny little bit of commercial food, like something that you buy from 7-Eleven or CVS or Safeway, my inflammation markers would immediately jump, even from a tiny amount. So I said, this guy must have a point. Saturated. So basically, without aspirin, saturated fat kept my inflammation markers down, and then polyunsaturated fat raised them, even a very small amount. So I would say around 2013, I started consciously avoiding any kind of PUFA, including fish oil.
And you list 1 to 2 grams. Is that based on research that you've done?
Yeah. Basically, I will provide I have provided the link on the forum. But the bottom line is there have been a lot of disagreements over the essentiality of PUFA going back to the 1950s, and even to this day, occasionally there are PubMed studies that pop up that say, look, even if we assume that PUFA is essential, I think you guys, and by you meaning the FDA and the USDA, that determine the dietary requirements per day, you're vastly overestimating the essentiality of PUFA. And it was shown that even in situations where you feed the rats just a little bit of PUFA, all of these symptoms that are claimed to be caused by EFA deficiency, they disappear immediately. So and any intake on top of that was not shown to be beneficial, right? So at the very best, you can say you can get away with, if you believe that PUFA is essential, and I don't, you can get away with eating no more than a gram or two of PUFA per day, which you can get from just eating the eggs, just like you mentioned. Anything on top of that is at best, eating non-essential fat, and knowing how fat metabolism contributes to degenerative diseases. Even if assuming is not bad, just having more fat than what is necessary and essential is what the FDA believes is just not. It's not a good idea, in my opinion.
So, Georgi, you mentioned that the metabolism of the unsaturated fats, or the PUFA, they're synthesized into the eicosanoids and the leukotrienes, and that these are major pathway to inflammation.
Basically, the eicosanoids and leukotrienes are types of prostaglandins, and they're mostly derived from arachidonic acid, which is one of the omega-6 acids, and is widely known. It has been widely known ever since the early 20th century to be the main mediator of inflammation and actually cellular growth and division. So believe it or not, in some circles, actually, arachidonic acid in some bodybuilders inject it intravenously so that they can spur muscle growth. So this tells you immediately both that Ray's right and how stupid some people are. Now, the primary purpose of every cell is to grow. All primitive cellular life forms, that's really all they do. They just eat and grow. So we are, in a sense, a mechanism for suppressing excessive growth. And excessive growth is mainly driven by inflammation. So if PUFA are the main driver, if not the only driver of inflammation, then basically PUFA are the main driver of cellular growth and dead differentiation. In other words, they cause you to revert to a primitive organism like a yeast or some kind of a bacteria that all it does, it eats, and through primitive metabolism, it divides, because that's the only, the energy from the primitive metabolism is sufficient only for that. So if you eat PUFA, this means high inflammation. This means your cells will prefer to dividing versus differentiating. In other words, you're getting closer to the cancer metabolism.
And the problem with the growth and not differentiating the cells is it interferes with renewal of the organism, correct?
Exactly, yes. Cells, they act as part of a field, as Ray said, and by reverting them back to their growth potential, in other words, due to high inflammation or intake of PUFA, the organism sort of loses its coherence. So in other words, you're no longer a human. You're just a collection of cells, but they're not guided by any coherent field. We are all a collection of cells, but these cells, every human being is perceived as a coherent field. And PUFA interfere very powerfully with that coherence. They sort of tell you, okay, there is no field, just a collection of cells. They're independent of each other, and the only purpose is survival. And how do they survive? By dividing and growing.
And you mentioned that the polyunsaturated fat, the products that they're metabolized into, the eicosanoids and leukotrienes, are major triggers of histamine, which is, I think it might be agreed upon that histamine is a problem in excess, but also serotonin. And serotonin, we'll probably have to demystify this till the ends of our lives, but that is also a problem, increasing serotonin synthesis.
Yeah, it's a huge problem because you can look at the organism in two ways. A low metabolism, in other words, glycolysis, versus high metabolism, so the phosphorylation. And it has been shown that in animals that hibernate, serotonin is the primary driver of hibernation, and serotonin actually causes their metabolism to slow down, and it increases the activity of glycolysis versus oxidative phosphorylation. So in other words, and the mechanism by which PUFA increase histamine, so histamine drives serotonin synthesis directly, but PUFA has another way of increasing serotonin. First of all, it interferes with cytochrome C oxidase, which we'll talk about later. And also another thing it does is it displaces tryptophan from albumin. Normally tryptophan in the blood is bound to albumin, and free tryptophan gets through the blood-brain barrier. And the level of serotonin in the brain is determined by the ratio of tryptophan versus the so-called large neutral amino acids. In other words, the branch-chain amino acids, tyrosine and phenylalanine. So the more tryptophan you get to the brain, and the lower amount of the other acids, the amino acids that get to the brain, the more serotonin you will synthesize. And PUFA are the main driver of increased tryptophan availability in the brain. So more PUFA means more tryptophan and more serotonin in the brain. It means lower metabolism.
And that's independent of the serotonin's production in the bowel. Is that right?
That's correct. Yes, basically 90% of the serotonin is produced in the bowel, and I posted a study that showed that this production in the bowel is mainly driven by the bacteria in the gut. So animals that had their gut bacteria killed by antibiotics produced about 90% less serotonin in their gut than other animals. However, the brain serotonin is separate. It's synthesized by the enzyme called tryptophan hydroxylase type 1. The peripheral serotonin, the one in the gut, is synthesized by tryptophan hydroxylase type 2. Now, when tryptophan floats around freely in the blood, it gets to the brain, and there's nothing there to inhibit it unless you take a specific tryptophan hydroxylase type 1 inhibitor, such as phenytoin, which Ray also talked about. In other words, the brain serotonin production is independent of the gut serotonin production, even though the two are related. If you have high brain serotonin, this will slow down metabolism, make the gut bacteria more active, so you'll end up with high gut serotonin as well. But the production of the two is generally separate.
And for the people that are doubting the veracity of the problematic serotonin, they can look into effectiveness of cyproheptadine as pretty much a wonder drug, and in addition to ondansetron, which can treat a lot of different problems. And you mentioned a couple other anti-serotonin drugs.
Drug industry likes to call them serotonin receptor antagonists. In reality, there is no such thing as the receptor. Like Ray said, the entire cell is the receptor, and what gets into the cell and what is kept out is determined primarily by the energetic status of the cell. So if the cell is low on energy, so to speak, more bad stuff will get in, and the cell will have a hard time getting it out. But some of the other anti-serotonin drugs that have been found to be beneficial include ketanserin, rianserin, meanserin, all of the RINs, the way I'd like to call them. They all act mostly on the so-called serotonin receptor type 2. And then there are some of the older drugs that were derived from LSD, such as bromocriptine, cabergoline, glyceride. They're considered more to be more dopamine agonists. However, it was just recently discovered that dopamine itself inhibits the enzyme tryptophan hydroxylase type 1. So taking a dopamine drug, so dopamine and dopamine agonist actually. So taking a dopamine drug means that you will synthesize less serotonin in the brain as well.
And you mentioned keeping a cell in its high oxidative metabolism state was essential for it being able to maintain its coherence and structure. And a main part of that is by the activity of cytochrome C oxidase. An easy argument against the polyunsaturated fats is they're extremely detrimental to this enzyme, if you wanted to talk about that.
Yeah, sure. Basically, it was shown that whenever animals were fed a diet high in PUFA, and what the study determined is high, is really what constitutes the average intake of most human beings in the Western world. So basically your regular Western diet dramatically decreased the levels of cytochrome C oxidase, which is a copper-dependent enzyme in the organism, by up to 90%. So without that, you cannot have oxidative phosphorylation. And it was just discovered many brain diseases are actually really symptoms of cytochrome C oxidase deficiency. I posted some studies that show that animal models of diseases like ALS, Parkinson's, Alzheimer's were all greatly helped, and the survival was extended by adding supplemental copper to the diet. Now, basically, the more PUFA you eat, the less cytochrome C oxidase you have, and the less oxidative phosphorylation your cells can perform. So in the absence of that, the only other thing that the cells can do is glycolysis. So chronically, eating diet chronically high in PUFA will force your cells to essentially adopt the cancer metabolism.
And that's Warburg's discovery in, I think, 1931. I think he got the Nobel Prize for discovering cytochrome C oxidase.
Yeah, that's correct. And what's stunning to me is that even though the guy Warburg had, I believe, 2 Nobel prizes, he's virtually unknown. If you talk to anybody with a medical degree, the only thing they know about him is the Warburg effect, even though Warburg talked about a lot more, including things that can not so much inhibit glycolysis, but prevent glycolysis from becoming excessive. And some of these things Ray touched upon, but they're really coming from Warburg's original research. And these include thiamine, which is vitamin B1, biotin, which is another one of the B vitamins, and niacinamide. So it's amazing that that these that the combination of PUFA and the suppression of cytochrome oxidase plays such a large role in health and metabolism in general. And it was known back in the 1930s, but to this day, it's largely a fringe area of research if you want to do research on metabolic cause of diseases. I've actually talked to some people that work at the National Institutes of Health. They've told me that unofficially this is considered largely a dead end. If you really want funding from the government, and you should not be working on metabolic causes of diseases. Genetics is the preferred field.
The mitochondria of the cell is not only where energy is produced along with carbon dioxide, but it's also where steroids are produced. And you don't often hear some of the pro-PUFA people ever talk about steroids in general, let alone the idea that PUFA damages the mitochondria and inhibits steroid synthesis.
Yeah, basically it was discovered as soon as some of the drugs that there were some drugs that are currently available on the market to treat to so-called treat. I don't really believe they're treating it, to treat hair loss and the condition called benign prostate hyperplasia. In other words, enlarged prostate, but it's not cancerous yet. So these drugs, what they do is they inhibit the enzyme 5-alpha reductase, and that enzyme is well known again in the bodybuilding world. It's the enzyme that converts testosterone into its more powerful androgen cousin, dihydrotestosterone. Now, it was noticed, in addition, this is also the enzyme that converts progesterone into another neurosteroid called allopregnanolone. Mm-hmm. So as soon as these drugs were approved, even during the clinical trials, two things were noticed. One is that these people, the people who were on these drugs, suffered from some kind of a depression, which was really not amenable to treatment with the currently available SSRI drugs. And that's a whole story of whether they're effective or not. But these people immediately started suffering from depression, and also they started suffering from muscle loss. And this tells you basically that the drug interferes with an enzyme that is very important to both your brain and your musculature. And how much muscle you have largely determines how fast your metabolism is. So you can say in effect that drugs like finasteride or PUFA basically destroy your muscles and destroy your brain. And allopregnanolone is one of the most powerful steroids, protective steroids in the brain, together with its precursor, pregnenolone, progesterone. There's also pregnanolone, pregnanidione. There are a number of steroids that all are from pregnenolone, and 5-alpha reductase is a crucial enzyme into converting them from one to the other. And without that enzyme or inhibiting it strongly, it essentially means suboptimal brain function, which the designers of the drug freely admitted upon applying for approval to the FDA. They said that, for unknown reason at the time, this drug caused severe depressive symptoms in the majority of the population that was studied.
In medical culture, there's a widespread belief that androgens are involved with acne, baldness, PCOS. Is that a mistaken belief, do you think?
I don't know about PCOS, but I think as far as baldness, prostate cancer, I think this is actually, in my opinion, is close to a criminal negligence. Ray wrote in one of his earlier articles that not only he disagrees that androgens are the cause of prostate cancer, but he thinks they should be used as a treatment. And lo and behold, about 2 years after he wrote that article, the pop press published a reference to a study in which they showed that patients with terminal prostate cancer, in other words, these are people who are told they have no more than 3 to 4 months to live, when they got testosterone injections directly into their prostate, they all basically fell into remission. And not only that, but the metastatic masses that grew into their livers and their lungs, they all disappeared. So I don't know what else would tell you that that this theory of the androgens causing prostate cancer is wrong, other than showing that using an androgen in a disease that's terminal stops it in its tracks. So as far as prostate cancer is concerned, I think the medical field is dead wrong on that. I also think that the medical field is wrong on the cause of baldness, because if the androgens were the cause of baldness, 20-year-old men would be bald, and 60-year-old men will have a full stock of hair.
That's the most simple observation. And when I'll frequently go to baldness forums, and every now and then somebody will say that exact thing. and they'll just be crucified in the forum for how stupid like that sentiment is, which is just boggles the mind.
I'll be curious to see what the argument against the androgens is, because frankly, even if you look at the official studies, they'll admit at this point that androgens are not the only agent. Now they're saying estrogen and prolactin and cortisol, things that Ray said 20 years ago, that they also play a role, but they're still claiming that the androgens are somehow involved. The funny thing is, if in the simplistic medical theory here, they're saying the elevation of one of these agents causes baldness, right? Well, a lot of them are actually, inversely correlated. So you can't really have a high estrogen and a high dihydrotestosterone at the same time. I just don't know of a case like that. And there's a good physiological reason. Usually people with high androgens, because androgens like dihydrotestosterone themselves are actually estrogen receptor antagonists and aromatase inhibitors. So if you have a high dihydrotestosterone, you will have low estrogen. So something there doesn't add up. It's one or the other, or the whole theory is wrong.
And that, just to pick your brain a bit, that the DHT increasing, if that were to happen, that would be a protective mechanism, do you think? I
think this is one of the most protective steroids that both a man or a woman can produce. There were recently some studies. Originally they were done in rats, but recently they were repeated with humans, and they were repeated successfully. So they showed that basically it has been known that the steroid dihydroepiandrosterone, DHEA, which is also a precursor to dihydrotestosterone, works really well in preventing and even treating osteoporosis in postmenopausal women. Now, the official statement is that the osteoporosis in these patients is caused because of low estrogen. However, when the one group was given estrogen and the other one was given dihydroepiandrosterone, the estrogen group had actually higher rates of fracture versus the DHEA group. And when they measured the blood levels of the hormones, they found that people supplemented with DHEA had abnormally, quote unquote, high levels of dihydrotestosterone. And when they administered an androgen receptor antagonist, in other words, when they blocked the effects of dihydrotestosterone, the women that were given DHEA also had fractures. So it shows you that the dihydrotestosterone, androgens in general, are crucial for bone health, and they're also active neurosteroids. It is well known that men with low testosterone, actually both men and women with lower levels of androgens, are much more prone to depression and other psychiatric conditions.
So you mentioned osteoporosis, and something that might surprise some people is that serotonin is involved in osteoporosis, not in estrogen. And you compared the polyunsaturated fat's ability to activate tryptophan hydroxylase to radiation. And I thought that was an interesting comparison. And if somebody were to try to explain the benefits of polyunsaturated fats, they'd have to explain the benefits of radiation, which I've actually ironically heard. So, I think a paleo advocate once, I had an email back and forth with them, and they were telling me that radiation was hormesis, which seems to be kind of like the standard argument for anything that's like slightly toxic or overtly toxic. They'll say, oh, it's hormetic, and you should still take it.
Yeah, funny in quotes, because it's really not funny at all, but the funny thing about all these people is that they say, oh yeah, low dose radiation is hormesis, and at the same time they admit that radiation, the danger of radiation, is cumulative. So how can something be hormetic if I keep doing it? In theory, if it's hormetic and I keep doing it in low doses, it should be beneficial. But at the same time, if I cross a certain threshold, which by the way turned out to be fraudulent, and I posted a study about that on the forum as well. So if I cross the threshold, suddenly it becomes carcinogenic. So you can't have it both ways. If it's cumulative, then it cannot be good for you in the long run. So any talk about hormesis, even if it were true, can only apply to a single or at most, just a few times a lifetime exposure. Not like these hundreds of X-rays and CT scans that people are having on an annual basis to prevent disease, quote unquote.
So another strike against the essentiality of the unsaturated fats is that animals made deficient in the so-called essential fatty acids have extremely high metabolic rates, and they're really hard to kill with things like endotoxin.
Yeah, that's right. And one of the reasons is that basically one of the main mechanisms through which endotoxin causes its detrimental effects on the body is because it raises the production of serotonin itself. So you can get an actual serotonin syndrome from if you get a decent dose of endotoxin in your bloodstream. Now, what happens is that because the animals that are deficient in PUFA, in these animals, the enzyme tryptophan hydroxylase is really low, both in the gut and in the brain. So even if you give them endotoxin, it doesn't trigger the production of serotonin that it does in animals that eat the normal, PUFA-laden diet. So that's one of the main mechanisms why a PUFA deficiency will protect you from endotoxin. There are others as well.
And back up just a second. What is endotoxin? It's produced in the intestine.
Endotoxin is produced by the bacteria. Basically, when bacteria digest food, it is a byproduct of bacterial digestion. Its official name is lipopolysaccharide. So in a sense, it is a type of sugar. However, when the white blood cells in your bloodstream sense that, they interpret this as a sign of infection. So basically, you get an immune response whenever there is a significant dose of endotoxin in your bloodstream. Now, people with a good immune system, they can probably brush it off pretty easily, or at most get a symptom of a mild flu, which is also one of another topic we can talk about. Whether the flu is really caused by virus or whether it's a symptom of endotoxin poisoning. But basically, people with good immune system can brush it off, while people with compromised immune system, they cannot really muster up immune response, and also the overload of serotonin can cause their lungs to fail and their heart. Serotonin is one of the primary mediators of fibrosis in the human body. Anti-serotonin drugs are currently actually getting approved, and pretty quickly so, for treating things like cystic fibrosis, heart failure, liver cirrhosis, which is actually liver cirrhosis really is fibrosis of the liver. So it shows that serotonin has a very quick and detrimental effect on many organs and tissues. And endotoxin raises serotonin tremendously in people who eat a decent amount of PUFA.
And the fibrosis is an excess production of collagen within the tissue, and the tissue is being presumably de-energized by serotonin?
Yeah, basically, you can think of collagen as a type of scar, which it really is. It's like when you get a wound on your skin, on the surface of the skin. Basically, the cells around it, in the process of healing, they sort of overdivide and overgrow, and that's really why you get the scar. The scar is a tissue that is not very, it's not permeated well by blood vessels, so it doesn't get good nutrition. In the absence of good nutrition, it sort of solidifies and hardens and even calcifies at some point. And the calcification thing is one of the hallmarks of cancer. So anything that has a fibrotic effect, and PUFA does have that effect, ultimately will cause, at the very least, fibrosis, or at worst will cause some sort of a undivided and uncontrolled growth, in other words, cancer.
And you mentioned this previously, but the polyunsaturated fats are strongly immunosuppressive. They're found in higher levels in AIDS patients, and then they're used to suppress the immune system for organ transplants?
Yeah, that's correct. It first started in the 1960s in the UK. I forgot the name of the researcher, but I can provide it to you later. What he noticed is that because he's doing experiments with rats and doing kidney transplants, liver transplants, and he noticed that whenever the rats were fed on a high PUFA diet, specifically linoleic acid, was one of the main examples of omega-6 PUFAs. Whenever he fed them at that high, and again, when I say high by the animal standards, really, when you look at it and convert to human dosage, it comes down to about 10 grams per human per day, which is probably what most people end up getting nowadays. Anyways, when he fed these rats, they did not reject the organs, and when he investigated further, he found that this was due to the fact that in these animals, the PUFA raised the production of cortisol and serotonin, and both of these substances are immunosuppressive. So it is well-established practice in transplantations to administer immunosuppressive drugs, sometimes for life. Now, I guess this is probably one of the few, so to speak, valid reasons for using PUFA in a person who has had a liver transplant. But even that, I think that there are other ways to achieve the same with less side effects. Anything that suppresses your immune system ultimately will give you a life-threatening infection. Recently, there have been a huge increase in cases of so-called It's the abbreviation is PML. P as in Paul, M as in Mary, L as in Larry. The ML stands for multifocal leukoencephalopathy, and it's caused by the JC virus, which about 90% of the population around the world carries. But in the vast majority of people, it's kept under control by the immune system. But immunosuppressed people, this virus gets activated and essentially causes a very rapid deterioration of the nervous system with invariably lethal effect. And it was noticed by the same researcher that these rats, even though they did not reject the organs that were transplanted, they died of some kind of a neurological deterioration. And I don't know if it was PML, but it matches with the current data that is known on humans, that immunosuppressed people have a much higher chance of dying from a viral encephalitis disease like PML.
So some of the people that are advocating polyunsaturated fat intake or think that restriction is ridiculous, these are some of the same people that advocate lowering the cholesterol. And you've noted that an accumulation of polyunsaturated fat inhibits endogenous cholesterol production. So perhaps if you paint this picture, which I think is incorrect, if you're consuming polyunsaturated fats, you're decreasing your endogenous cholesterol production, you're lowering your so-called bad cholesterol LDL and increasing your so-called good cholesterol HDL. And perhaps this is a reason to consume polyunsaturated fats.
Yeah, in that context, sure, if you believe these things. But even the main medical establishment has already admitted that that cholesterol, at least dietary cholesterol, is no longer of concern. Now, they haven't gone as far as to say that endogenous cholesterol production is not a concern, but FDA officially about 2 months ago said, you can eat all the cholesterol you want. It really doesn't matter in terms of cardiovascular disease and stroke and things like that. So 30 years and billions of dollars of research and producing all of these drugs, and now they're saying it just doesn't matter. It's just not that important at best, right? And we know that cholesterol is the precursor to all of your steroids. So if you lower your cholesterol, which by the way, the steroid production in hypothyroid people is already low. So if you deprive them of that nutrient, which has many other properties on its own, Ray talked about some of them, such as cholesterol protects against viral infections. It can neutralize some pathogens that enter the system that if the white blood cell count is not high enough. So anyways, so basically, in compromised people, if you lower their cholesterol even more, you're exposing them to all kinds of sort of assaults from the environment and even internally that they would have been able to handle better if their cholesterol levels were higher. I provided a study which showed that low levels of LDL predate the cancer diagnosis by more than a decade. And that was independent of any other lifestyle choices such as smoking, drinking excessively, doing drugs, living next to a power plant. I don't know if the researchers control for that, but they claim they control for a lot of harmful lifestyle factors. So it shows that it's a pretty powerful thing, and it's probably not a good idea to blindly lower it, especially considering the fact that the official theory doesn't say that we know with certainty that it's cholesterol that's causing these plaques to form on the arteries. If you actually take these plaques, you really see that it's a combination of PUFA and calcium and a few other things. So cholesterol may be there, but it's more like to protect from the damage and the inflammation in the vessel wall that PUFA and the calcium deposits are causing. So it's there by accident, not as a causative agent.
Were the fats damaging the ability of the cell to make the steroids by? Is it the reducing agent like NADPH?
Yeah, basically, PUFA. If you eat bad fine PUFA, and actually there's some evidence that excess fat intake, whether it's saturated or not, will do the same, but to a much smaller degree. But if you load up on PUFA, and actually which will raise your inflammatory markers, and in order for the body to sort of quench them, it uses the substance called NAD, which is nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide. And the NADH is the reduced version of it. So NAD is the oxidized and NADH is the reduced version of it. And it has been shown that the NAD to the NADH ratio is perhaps the best health biomarker currently available. The higher the ratio is, the healthier you are, the longer you would live, and the more resistant you'll be to a disease. And the lower the ratio, the more prone you are to disease. As a matter of fact, high NADH levels are a diagnostic, one of them, not the only, but a diagnostic biomarker for several cancers, for Parkinson's disease, for Alzheimer's disease. In other words, they show that your body is in a reduced state. And PUFA is one of the most powerful substances that lowers the NAD to the NADH ratio. In other words, it raises the levels of NADH. It puts you in a reduced state. You don't want to be that.
The growth cancer state.
Exactly. So in a reduced state with not enough oxygen, basically the NAD to the NADH ratio determines how well your body is oxidized, how much oxygen is available to the cells, and it actually how well they're using it, because just providing oxygen to the cells is very often counterproductive. So it shows you how much carbon dioxide you're producing and how well your tissues are oxygenated. And PUFA really puts you far away from that state. It's one of the few agents. Also, radiation does the same. I think that's one of the reasons why I compared PUFA to radiation, is because the two are very powerfully lower the NAD to the NADH ratio. It puts you in a disease state, and if done for I don't know how long, but if you don't want to be in that state, it's a disease state, even if it's there temporarily.
So my absolute favorite thing you listed on this post that kind of inspired us to chat was, you can take all this information, but ultimately experiment is the ultimate arbiter, and no amount of bickering or arguing over this or that study is going to make any difference if you don't test it out yourself and try to gather information about yourself to get a better understanding of what's going on in your own body.
Yeah, I strongly encourage everybody to really do that. I mean, I don't want to sound like Ray, I'm sure he doesn't want to sound like the ultimate authority in the subject. He does say that something along the lines that, if the ultimate human faculty is the one that experiences, then experiment is the ultimate knowledge. Something along those lines. So go ahead, try it out yourself, and see how it makes you feel. And if possible, try to confirm that with some tests. I do have some suggested tests on the forum, and I'm sure, Danny, you also provide a list of valuable tests to people that they can do themselves. But you'll see the results yourself. I'm pretty confident. In as little as 1 month, which was one study done with monkeys, which I think are the closest relatives to humans that I've seen a study with, in as little as 1 month, actually in as little as 2 weeks of fat-free diet and 1 month of a very low-fat diet, their tissues got fully depleted of PUFA, and their metabolism basically increased twofold. All the animals lost all the excess fat that they have, and essentially, their respiration became uncoupled. And I think it's not that difficult for people to actually experiment and find it out for themselves, which I think that's the ultimate goal. You should find out what works for you. All Ray, Peat, and I personally am doing is trying to provide some directions for personal experimentation. I don't mean to sound like I know it all. I really don't.
That was amazing. The last part I wanted to touch upon was, say you're going out, say you have to eat PUFA. What are some things you can do to mitigate the damage of a high PUFA meal?
Some of the best things you can do to prevent the damage from even occurring is probably take a low dose vitamin E. Ray has said that as little as 200 units, international units will be sufficient. There will be about, let's say, 2/3 of 200 is about 150 milligrams. Probably will be sufficient if you prefer milligrams. Most capsules on the market provide 400 units or above. That should be enough to prevent the damage that PUFA does. And one of the ways that vitamin E prevents that damage is it turns the PUFA into saturated fat. Now, the exact mechanism is still not known, but it's known that it happens. So when you eat this PUFA and you take the vitamin E, even if you end up storing that fat, it should be stored as saturated fat, which is a lot more benign, both as stored fat and as actively burned fat than PUFA.
Georgi, thank you so much for chatting with me. That was extremely informative, and I'm going to have to chew on a lot of it. Before you go ahead and let everybody know where they can find you on Idea Labs as well as raypeatforum.com.
Sure. My information is pretty easy for people that are members of the forum. I am forum member Haidut. Simple enough. It's spelled HAI, D as in dog, U, T as in Tom. And when you log into the forum, you'll be able to find me very easily. I comment on a lot of posts. I put a lot of new posts. So just try to get to one of the discussions, or use the search box to search for Haidut, and you'll find me. My profile on the forum has a link to my website where I sell some supplements. I would like to point out that I'm not a salesman. I don't want you to buy my supplements. They're there simply to let you experiment if you don't have the time to experiment yourself. But I actively encourage you to go out there if you're willing to do it and you have the time. Find the raw ingredients yourself and perform the experiments yourself and make your own supplements if you want to. But if you're interested in my supplements, you can find them in the profile of the forum. If you want to send me an email, again, it's very easy. It's my username Haidut@gmail.com. And my Skype nick is Haidut and the number 3 at the end. And so far, I've answered every email that was sent to me. So I would say probably email is preferable. And the forum is really the best because whenever I have a discussion with people, I would like, if possible, for the rest of the forum members to see it because it gives them additional knowledge. Some people may have the same issue. Some people may have additional comments and suggestions. Really, the purpose of the forum is to spur the discussion and get the collective knowledge flowing, not so much to help just one individual person or listen to only one member of the forum.
Georgi, thank you so much for talking with me today.
Thank you, Danny. I really appreciate it, and good luck with all of your endeavors, and I look forward to speaking to you again soon.
That concludes this week's episode of Generative Energy. That was my first conversation with Georgi, and I really enjoyed it, so I think we're going to do some more. So leave a comment, whether it be on Facebook or YouTube or wherever you can leave comments, or tweet me or whatever if you enjoyed the podcast, and give us subjects that you want us to talk about. So we were thinking about some about osteoporosis or hair loss or increasing testosterone or increasing progesterone, and just topics to talk about because Georgi is obviously a huge wealth of information. So thanks again for listening, and I'll talk to you guys soon.